Hi everyone, I'm Paolo Gerbaudo. I'm the director of the Center for Digital Culture, and I'm here to welcome you to this great event, Social Media and the US Elections, where we will discuss how social media influenced and shaped the US elections in 2020. I mean, the US elections are finally over. I mean, they've been going on for much longer than expected because of the slow vote counting operations, and there are still contestations from Trump's camp. I don't know if you saw the presser yesterday with Rudy Giuliani dripping something from his hair. It's a quite surreal situation, and it's a typical 2020 election, we would say. I mean, this year we have seen everything going on from pandemics to lockdowns to conspiracy theory protests and everything. So perhaps it was a fitting election for this year. This is our first event this year. I mean, due to the pandemic conditions, we have been obviously since March only having online events, online talks, and our online conference. And today, to discuss these very interesting topics, we have three excellent speakers. We have Daniel Kreis, who is still trying to join us, but should be with us soon, who is associate professor at the University of North Carolina. And his research is very closely related to the topic that we will discuss today. Namely, it looks at digital campaigning and the impact of technological change on the public sphere and on political organization. He is the author of Taking Our Country Back, The Crafting of Network Politics from Howard Dean to Barack Obama, sort of historical book looking at the transformation of digital campaigning in its early stage, we can say from the vantage point of 2020, and of Prototype Politics, the making and unmaking of technological innovation in the Republican and Democratic parties, 2000 to 2014, which was published in 2016. Then we have Georgia Parke, who is the former digital communications director and press secretary for Senator Bernie Sanders. So Georgia will have a lot to tell us about how social media shaped both the primary elections, right, and the primary phase, and then how they shaped the final campaign in 2020. And we also have Laura Porat, who is a motion graphic designer, who has been producing some very cool graphics, working both for the Elizabeth Warren's campaign, right, during the primaries, and then for Joe Biden's campaign in this 2020 election campaign. I mean, I have a lot of questions for our speakers and a lot of curiosities and interest in this topic, because I think, I mean, this election comes at a time when social media have continued in their incremental, right, growth in terms of influence, where now, if you look at the Pew Research Center surveys, I mean, it almost approximates the influence of TV in terms of a source of political information, in terms of a space of political conversation. It comes after the 2016 election, where Trump's success was largely framed as originating from his social media prowess, right, and also from dirty tactics, Cambridge Analytica, and so on and so forth. And I mean, for example, one question I have there, I mean, how did Biden manage to win when actually his social media visibility in theory was much lower than Trump's? And also a very strange context, because there was no ground game, no ground war, so-called, right? I mean, all the kind of get out the vote, knock on doors operation was halted for the most, at least on Joe Biden's camp, due obviously to the pandemic and COVID, and therefore the need to minimize as much as possible physical operations. So these are, I think, are some of the themes that I would like to hear about. And for a start, perhaps we can start with Laura, and then Georgia, and then Daniel. Yes? So Laura, if you want to start.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. like it was said earlier, I worked for the Elizabeth Warren campaign in the primaries, and then I worked full-time for Joe Biden's presidential campaign starting in July of this year, and then I just wrapped up on that. So a little bit of background: before I worked for the Warren campaign, I was working in entertainment back in LA, and then I joined the Warren campaign in December of 2019, and I was a full-time motion designer. And so for people who might be unfamiliar with the Warren campaign, basically she was very policy driven, so a lot of our videos were about policies. So one of my biggest jobs was how to translate her very, text-heavy policies and maybe very complicated ideas into graphics that the public, might be more accessible for the public. So that was a big challenge I faced, but also the Warren campaign had very polished design team, so we have very strong visual brand guidelines that we could follow, so that made things easier. She had very polished feel to all the designs and the graphics that we did. Actually, I will show one of the videos that I worked on for the Warren campaign. So let me just share to all right, I'm sharing my screen right now. Let me know if you can see it. This is one of the videos I made for the Warren campaign about the wealth gap. So I'll let this play. Yeah, so her campaign was very focused on taking down corruption and taking down big banks and that sort of thing. So that was a lot of the videos that we were doing. So Elizabeth Warren, oh, by the way, I was the only motion designer on the Warren campaign, so I had a lot of freedom to animate things how I wanted to animate, but it was important to just make sure that everything's readable. Is it easy to understand? Do you can anyone watch this on their phone? Can they watch it without sound? So there's a lot of things I took in consideration when animating things. And then so Elizabeth Warren dropped out in early March. So this is right before the pandemic was in full swing in America. And then I joined the Joe Biden campaign as a full-time motion designer in July 2020, and basically in the primaries, Joe Biden did not have a large digital team. They only had 2 people working there, one producer, 1 editor. So it was a very, very small operation. And then I think back in May, I think is when they really started scaling up the digital team, and they made a bunch of hires. So I was one of the many hires that they made. And by the end of the campaign, the digital team went from being one of the smallest, we were the largest team within the campaign itself. So the pandemic meant that Joe Biden couldn't actually hold in-person events. He couldn't, hold rallies. I mean, that didn't stop Trump, but Joe Biden was a little bit more careful about that. So that meant that the stuff that we did on the digital team was more important than ever. We had to get Joe Biden's message out there without, sometimes Joe Biden would be in the videos that we produced, but we also had to make videos where he didn't appear in them at all. So we had to, spread what does he want America to do? How does he differentiate himself from Trump, etc. So the difference in the styles between the Elizabeth Warren campaign and the Joe Biden campaign is that the Elizabeth Warren campaign was very policy driven. Like she was like very policy first. Like you knew exactly like what she wanted to accomplish. The Joe Biden campaign took a little bit of a different approach. They very much focus on his character and like how Joe Biden personally would be a better president than Donald Trump. So it was a very contrast situation with the Biden campaign, which I thought was interesting. Let me show you some of the stuff that I made for the Biden campaign. So I'm going to share my screen again. Yeah, so I did a bunch of stuff for the Joe Biden campaign for his social media. I made like Instagram videos, stories. We did, you know, like augmented reality, like Instagram apps, like filters, that sort of thing. So the Joe Biden campaign like really gave us the just wanted to get views and like Joe Biden's name out there. So by the end of the campaign, the digital team got over 1.5 billion views across our social media. So that was pretty crazy. And we did like a combination between like, you know, like videos about Joe Biden himself, but then we also do like rapid response videos pertaining to the news. So it was kind of funny because one of the people on our team would make a bunch of rapid response videos for the Joe Biden campaign. He was like this college student. He's only like 20 years old, but Donald Trump absolutely hated the videos that he made, and he like complained about this guy like on Twitter or at his rallies, and we're like, wow, Donald Trump has a feud with like a 20-year-old kid who's still a college student. So that was pretty funny. Yeah, I mean, working in the pandemic was really challenging. Our entire digital team was completely remote. So like we would have like a daily meeting where we would meet like once a day, but basically we're just kind of left to our own devices. So it was a challenge, but I mean, at the end, you know, we defeated Donald Trump and we had a successful campaign. So yeah, that's it.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Laura. It'd be interesting to hear perhaps more during the Q&A. I mean, also, this is actually really interesting in terms of campaign labor. I mean, how the exceptional conditions of the pandemic also led to changes in terms of, I mean, not having a centralized war room, or perhaps there was a minimal war room, I guess, but then much of the work was actually dispersed, right, with people working remotely on that. And also what you were saying before about actually the Biden's campaign initially having a very small digital team, and how that evolved through time, also because again of the pandemic and the need to have a stronger digital team. Perhaps during the Q&A we can look farther at these. While we are still waiting for Daniel Kreis to join us, Georgia, be very interesting to hear your experience. If I'm correct, you've been digital campaign coordinator for Sanders, I mean, in 2020, but also in 2016.
So yes, that's correct. I was on his campaign in 2020, although I started working for him just at the end of the 2016 campaign. So I wasn't there for all of that. I was still in school, but caught some of the end of that incredible period in Bernie's campaign cycle. So I'll just give a little background and introduction. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. So my name is Georgia Parke. I live in Washington, D.C. I worked for Bernie until very recently. I spent about 4.5 years on his communications team, primarily in social media, video, and design. And my most recent role was as his digital communications director and press secretary. I studied political communications, so this was always something that I hope to work in and hope to experience. And so I worked in his U.S. Senate office in his official capacity for a few years, and then joined the 2020 presidential campaign in February of 2019. So I'd love to just go back a little bit because Bernie, for those of you who don't know, has been somebody who has always been really interested in finding alternative ways to communicate with people, to be a little unconventional as a politician. He's been an independent for most of his life, although he ran as a Democrat in the Democratic primary, but sort of his whole political career has been finding ways to, use media differently. And I think his social media efforts during his campaign in 2016, in the time in between, and in 2020 was also very, I think, unconventional and innovative, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So back in the 1980s, when Bernie was actually the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, which is close to my hometown, he actually kind of started this unconventional approach. He started a public access TV show where he would go around the neighborhood and just interview people while he was the mayor. So he was a public speaker, and he would just go out and film a TV show, basically, just trying to reach out to regular people and hear their stories and just connect with the public a little bit better. I think that really carried on, into his time in Congress. So he was elected to Congress, to the U.S. House in the 1980s. And then, I don't know exactly when he started his Twitter or his Facebook, but I think it was before probably a lot of other people in Congress. And then again, elected to this U.S. Senate in 2006. So when he ran for president in 2016, I think he was a bit generally unknown, known sort of on the left probably very well, but not to the general public. And unexpectedly had a very successful campaign, even though he didn't end up winning the primary. But that, I think, was sort of the start of growing this very lively, dedicated base of fans through social media on the internet. Gaining millions of followers on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I believe they started this Snapchat account as well during the campaign. And another really major sort of hub for Bernie fans to congregate was on Reddit. So there was a Reddit subreddit that was created by some fans who ended up actually going on to work for the campaign because they were so successful at this. And they used it as a way to just raise millions of dollars in a grassroots way. And was through Reddit and through social media. And so that's sort of fitting with Bernie's, I think, habit of reaching out to people who might not be immediately engaged in politics, might not have a history of being involved in politics or even voting, but reaching out to people on places like Reddit, where they can be exposed to these policies, these ideas that he's advocating for. You would normally come across stuff on Reddit that might be super political, or especially 8 years ago, 5 years ago, and so that was sort of a way to expose people to some of Bernie's ideas for the first time. So although he wasn't actually successful in winning the primary, Hillary Clinton went on to win that primary, and then he endorsed Hillary and campaigned for her in the general in 2016. I think the 2016 campaign was a very big turning point in terms of growing that base, sharing the ideas of democratic socialism, sharing the ideas of Medicare for all, college as a right, healthcare as a human right, building, infrastructure, building an economy that works for working people and not just the billionaire class, and addressing climate change. So I think that was sort of a lot of the core of the 2016 campaign was building that audience and building that enormous following of people who may have been getting engaged in politics for the very first time. So that's where I came in, and I started working for the senator. And so we were back in his Senate office. He wasn't running for office, but he was still an elected official with a very big platform and the resources of a U.S. Senate office. And so he wanted to continue, reaching people in unconventional ways and using social media creatively to get our message across from our position in the U.S. Senate. So we actually did a lot of really creative things that were, first of all, fun news, but also I think a difference in the policy discourse in the U.S. in Congress. And so some of those things were we started to put on virtual town halls from the Capitol Visitor Center. We had a few over the course of the year. I think this was in 2018. Every couple of months, we'd put on a virtual town hall. We'd bring in experts on an issue. We did climate change, healthcare, inequality, foreign policy. We brought in Elizabeth Warren for one of them. We brought in, climate experts. We had doctors and nurses just, speaking directly to people about what is Medicare for all, how would it help people? Why are we fighting for it? And that first event actually got over 1 million views, I think. And so that was kind of a turning point for us to see, we could create our own sort of media from within a U.S. Senate office and be extremely creative about how we were using our office and our platform from the official government side to really not only reach our constituents, but to reach millions of people across the country and around the world. So the other things that we did is trying to bring in working people from around the country and feature them on our social media in our videos. We had one video featuring an Amazon worker explaining what the conditions were in Amazon warehouses, what it was like to live on a wage that was below $15 an hour, and just how incredibly difficult it was at a time when Jeff Bezos and other billionaires were making just unbelievable sums of money while the workers struggled just to get by. So that video that we put out featuring the Amazon worker went viral. It got millions of views, and so we continued that campaign. We featured more and more Amazon workers. All of these interviews were conducted over Skype. So very pre-pandemic, we were still doing the Skype interviews, the Skype videos, featuring people from wherever they were, and just trying to bring them into that conversation that was happening nationally, and hearing from people who were closest to the pain, most directly affected by what was going on. And eventually, Amazon did raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour a few months later. So we're very proud of how we were able to not just show Bernie and not just feature Bernie as a politician, but to hear from ordinary people, from working people who are really affected by the issues that we're discussing all the time. So that brings me to the 2020 campaign. So Bernie launched his 2020 campaign for president in February 2019. And from the beginning, we knew that our digital and social media operation was going to be a major priority because it was always a very big priority to Bernie. Right from the bat, digital was one of the largest departments. It was one of the first hires we made were videographers, people who could follow him on the trail, people who could live stream, and people who could get this all out on social media. So it was always going to be a very virtual campaign, even before COVID. Even though we were also doing lots of in-person events, it was very important to us and to Bernie that we had a heavily virtual campaign so that people around the country, around the world could also know what we were doing, hear our ideas, and just share in this experience. So one of the decisions we made right off the bat was to live stream every single event. So if he was doing 3 rallies in a day, we would live stream every single one of them on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and we also expanded our live streaming to Twitch as well, which is, if you don't know, it's a gaming platform where people live stream playing video games. And I think we were one of the first politicians, if not the first, to get an account on Twitch. So we weren't streaming him playing video games, unfortunately. I wanted to do that, but never got around to it. But we did stream his speeches, his town halls. Same thing as always, trying to share ideas in an unconventional way. And so that was kind of keeping with Bernie's strategy of using, reaching out to people where they might not already be in and trying to share these policies and ideas. To 200,000 views on every stream that we did. So we might have, an event in Nevada, which had a couple hundred people at it, but we had 100,000 people who saw it online at some point. So even though we have a few very important states like Nevada, New Hampshire, Iowa, there are a few places that were very important for us to win. From the beginning, it was a national campaign because it was, for on the virtual side, because we were always reaching out to every corner of the country through our digital media, through our social media. And so that was just one corner, was the live stream operation. We also had an entire produced video operation similar to what Laura was a part of on her campaigns. And we had a design team, we had a social team. It was very big, just a big team from the beginning that continued to grow. And I think in the end, we had about 100 million views just on our live streams. And that's across all of our platforms. So that, because Bernie has always been unconventional, he's been independent, he's been, ahead of ideas before they were popular and, helped them become popular. I think, our goal was always just to find ways to reach people directly, and social media was the best way to do that, and live streaming was the best way to do that. And I think the kind of technology and the platforms that have evolved since 2016 and since the 2012 campaign even, that all enabled us to do that, to have people with live streaming units like following him around every day. And so that was, like I said, that was just one aspect of it. We also, we tried to use memes as much as possible. Memes were actually a really successful way for us to fundraise. We would post memes because they're so shareable, and people think, oh my God, like Bernie's posting a meme, like this is so strange. This is so, this is so funny. So we tried to, sort of push. I take pride in trying to push the envelope a little bit in terms of what we could get away with. And I had a team that was also very creative and very helpful with that. So so we were able to raise millions of dollars just from organic social media with no advertising. And that was, granted, a very, very small portion of the overall fundraising, but I think it goes to show that, used properly, memes, social, live stream, it can and should be part of an overall fundraising strategy for campaigns. And then I'll just wrap up kind of by saying what we've been doing since the campaign ended. So Bernie dropped out in April, and he immediately endorsed Joe Biden. So our mission became electing Joe Biden, defeating us, advocating for state and local candidates. So it was a big adjustment to go from running a massive campaign with 1,000 people on it to having a small team that was entirely virtual. But we were very prepared for the virtual environment because we had been running a virtual campaign from the beginning, and we had a full live stream apparatus ready to go. So over the summer and through the fall, Bernie hosted about 30 virtual events focused on important states, important regions, important demographics that we wanted to make sure turned out to help elect Joe Biden. And we received about 25 million views on those events that we've held since Bernie ended his campaign. So I'll just go over quickly to wrap up. You know, our priorities have always been on Brand New social media to find ways to uplift working people, to show stories that haven't been told on the mainstream media, such as the Amazon worker, really anything to do with climate change, which really doesn't get enough attention in any type of media. And we had a series during the campaign of minimum wage workers sharing their experiences and you know why we need to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour nationally. So uplifting our volunteers, featuring regular people as much as possible. Bernie, you know, already had near universal name recognition in the U.S., so our job wasn't necessarily to get his name out there, but to get our policies out there and to focus on the policies that Bernie was advocating for, and help people, you know, share the stories that made, you know, the stories that are most compelling, I think, are the stories from people who are most deeply affected by U.S. government policy, by, you know, the changes that Bernie was proposing would make. So I think, you know, from the beginning, from when Bernie hosted his public access show to Reddit to the campaign, what always drew people in was the ideas and the policies. And so focusing on that as much as possible is what we tried to do to bring more people into the political process to keep our movement going. So even though, again, we didn't win the primary, I'm very glad Joe Biden won the election. I think we continued to grow that movement and build that social media sort of network, and almost have like a mini media company within the campaign, which I don't know, you know, has been done, how much that's been done in the past. I think this year in the primary especially, we had like major you know, digital campaigns on many different campaigns, on Warren's campaign, on several others as well. But I think, you know, focusing on our live streaming especially was a game changer for us, and that allowed us to reach so many more people than we would without social media.
Thanks very much, Georgia. I mean, this was very interesting. I mean, I think both presentations, I mean, really stand to show how much social media that until recently were considered to be a sort of auxiliary space or secondary space are now more and more, perhaps not the central battlefield, but approaching it, right? I mean, TV is still perhaps, right, the core mechanism through which you reach voters, especially older voters, and I think still presidential debates continue to be a quite important, say, turning point in the campaign, right? And also this year that was the case, and obviously, at least in the primary season, say, there were rallies, there was a lot of door knocking, there was a lot of ground campaign, but really much of the, how would you say, the campaign activity and the enthusiasm, right, of the campaign is really drawn from social media. I mean, this is really a question that I've been considering for a long time. I mean, ultimately, what is, say, the killer application of social media for political purposes? And to me, it seems to a great extent that it's creating this sort of diffuse militancy, as it were, right? I mean, these sympathizers / supporters, right, who then play this important role in sharing contents, in so doing, basically multiplying the visibility of contents, and therefore the motion design that Laura has been showing us, or memes or live streams. I mean, they actually make for very suitable content to do precisely this, right? To make people in a way comfortable sharing these, because perhaps it's also something that is not too spiky, is not too political, and in so doing they allow to broaden the conversation. So we are still waiting for Daniel Kreis. Unfortunately, we have some technical problems. We blame it on Microsoft, obviously. And but we have been getting quite a bit of questions from the public. So perhaps while we see if we manage to connect with Daniel, we can start a bit our debate. I mean, I think there are many interesting questions there, and I invite attendees to ask more questions, because we have time actually to discuss them. I mean, some questions range from really the specificity of the pandemic. What does it mean to do digital campaigning in pandemic conditions? Was it more or less important? There are more practical questions. For example, one addressed to Laura, which is about basically what is the most challenging part of creating these videos, right, for the Biden campaign. Then one question on the prominence of social media vis-a-vis television, right, which is really one question that political communications experts are asking themselves on a very regular basis, and every year it looks like is the time when there will be a final change, say, in the landscape of political communications, but obviously it's something far more incremental and slow-paced in a way. Another question on, I think this one is really interesting. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about this election was the very high voter turnout, right? And in particular, very high youth vote, right? So there is a question that refers specifically to that question, namely what role social media played in mobilizing these new voters. I'll just go through them in one go, and then we'll focus on some of them. Another question relates to, I mean, this one is really interesting. I think that social media presence in this election, according to Anonymous, because all our attendees, unfortunately, are anonymous, focus on viral moments. For example, some famous sequences from vice presidential debates. I mean, we could also consider the Giuliani infamous presser from yesterday, also another viral moment that has already produced an avalanche of memes about hair dye and you name it. Another question on fake news, which obviously is another very interesting question, one that was very present there back in 2016. I mean, some things have changed there, right, with more regulation or more promise of self-regulation, right, from social media platforms, but then is also a question that is still very much open. Also because we've seen all sorts of conspiracy theories flying during the pandemic, many of them associated with the right and the far right. Question on Generation Z. And finally, yeah, I mean, an interesting question, though. Obviously, you are both from campaigns of Democratic candidates. Perhaps also you have some opinions, perhaps on Trump's digital campaign. I mean, how effective it was. What were the elements that were not really effective? I mean, was it something to do with his campaigning strategy, or perhaps his campaigning strategy was excellent in the relative conditions, but really the sort of what Trump had accumulated in terms of dissatisfaction by the electorate in 4 years of administration was something that couldn't be changed even by the best campaign one could have imagined. Right? So these are all the questions in one go, but then let's perhaps start from, I mean, the question that was addressed, I mean, two questions addressed to Laura specifically. I mean, first, so, I mean, what is the most challenging bit when you are working on these motion designs, and how much of your campaign and of your campaign activity is geared specifically towards Generation Z as a specific section of the electorate? Laura.
Yeah, great question. So one of the most challenging aspects of working, wait, I'm sorry, what was the first question? It was like working during the pandemic?
Yeah, the first one was, I mean, what is the most challenging bit when you are producing these videos? What is the most challenging bit in producing them? Yeah, I mean, I think it's not specified whether it's a technical thing or a creative thing or a, say, more political thing, but say, what is the aspect that you find the most challenging doing that?
Yeah, I guess the most challenging thing is just making, because like political campaigns, like they want to cram so many ideas into like a single video. So a lot of the most challenging thing I faced was kind of like culling away like what is absolutely necessary to be in the video or not necessary. So like we don't need to make like a 10-minute video about like climate change, for example. Like we can focus on one specific aspect of climate change that Joe Biden wants to address. So I think that was a challenge. Also, another challenge is that with such a high-profile campaign, I mean, like all eyes were on us, so you didn't want to make a video and accidentally offend like a certain like demographic or maybe a certain like geographical region. So maybe certain areas of the country are more sensitive to certain aspects, like, you know, climate change is a great thing, but, you know, in areas of like Pennsylvania, for example, like they're concerned over like fracking and that sort of thing where a lot of their jobs come from. So that was a tricky thing to balance. You know, we definitely want to appeal to mainly Americans, but also like we have ideals that, you know, we want to accomplish. So that was challenging. And then what was the second question?
The second question was referred to whether, I mean, when you are producing these designs, I mean, are you specifically, I mean, are you deliberately focusing on Generation Z users, or how does it work? I mean, is there a sort of differentiation in terms of socio-demographics you're trying to target, or is it a more kind of general strategy where you try to, in a way, in one go to address all these socio-demographics?
Yeah, so for Generation Z, I don't think we necessarily made videos explicitly for them, but a lot, since we're dealing with social media, a lot of our videos did, because, you know, they're the ones who are checking social media the most. Like they're the ones that are most active on certain platforms like Twitch. We also did like Fortnite, like custom like Fortnite like skins and that sort of thing. So like obviously they're gonna be using Fortnite more than like baby boomers, for example. So I don't think it was like, I mean, I can't speak for the whole campaign, but from my perspective, I don't think it was, you know, we are targeting this group specifically more so than any other group. I don't think it was like that, but certain things that we did appeal to them more than other things, if that makes sense.
Yes, definitely. Because I remember, I think Hillary Clinton's campaign, already back, what was it, in 2008, right? The first time she ran, that she was focusing a lot on micro trends, right? She had this guru who had developed the idea of micro trends, that namely was the idea of dividing the electorate in, say, 40 sections, say single mother with children, suburban or whatever, single man with this kind of attitude. And in a way, the kind of campaign strategy really focused on giving each one, according to circumstances, right, really appealing to these, right? So dropping references to them, for example, or developing policies that were specifically targeted at this electorate, right? Though some people criticize these kind of micro trends kind of approach, as it lacked a sort of unifying narrative, a sort of a coherent narrative. And then also it is very difficult to actually be able to cater one by one to all those sections of the electorate. But that was really interesting what you had to say about that. So now some question for Georgia, while we are still fighting with Microsoft Teams to get Daniel online. And there were a lot of questions that were very relevant to your work, Georgia. Yes, say, I mean, how prominent you think social media was in this election vis-a-vis 2016? And secondly, how important was social media in mobilizing these new voters, right?
Yeah, so I think, you know, obviously every year that social media exists, it reinvents itself and it becomes useful in new ways. So I think that, you know, you can't say that you know, that necessarily it determined the outcome of the primary or the general election, but I think you know, the ways in which we used it were to you know, fundraise, target specific you know, regions or people that we wanted to turn out, and especially the important states, and just bring in more, you know, general support for our ideas and our candidate. So I think compared to mainstream media such as, you know, cable TV, it's always different because it's direct. You know, you're not being interviewed by a reporter if you go live stream yourself to your supporters, but you're also not reaching a traditional cable news audience if you do that. So I think, you know, you have to consider demographically what are the limitations. I think for us, our supporters and our followers were overwhelmingly young, you know, not the kind of people who would watch cable TV, who might not even have a TV. I mean, I don't have cable, so, you know, people who get their news online, people who get their news on alternative forms of social media like Twitch and Reddit, and maybe not even on Facebook anymore, because I think Facebook, especially for younger people, has kind of fallen off as a major network. You know, people moving more towards Instagram and Snapchat, and even TikTok. We did have a TikTok account, although not until the very end of the campaign, but we did get one in. And so I think, you know, TV will always exist in some form, whether that's, you know, online, even if it's like Hulu or YouTube Live, stuff like that. It's not technically cable anymore, but there's still the major networks. I think will always exist as long as we have media. So, you know, I think they're all very important, but in different ways, and it pertains to which demographic are you targeting, who are you trying to turn out, where are you trying to get your message across, and it's, I think for Bernie, you know, being an independent and sometimes having views that were outside of the mainstream that we wanted to move in the mainstream, can benefit from going on TV a lot and getting more familiarity with the mainstream, you know, establishment audience, in like people based in Washington D.C. who make policy decisions. You know, hearing, you know, having more guests on to kind of to talk about Medicare for All or Green New Deal, that can help us in terms of the political establishment and also reaching a more traditional audience. But when we're trying to reach our audience specifically, who are younger, less likely to watch TV, more likely to you know, not have cable, things like that. It's just a different set of people that we're reaching. So I think all aspects are important, just the way that, you know, advertising is very important, and so is ground game, and so is field work, so is making calls and donating. Like, all of these aspects are important to a campaign. So I think with social media, we just try to do as much as we possibly can and reach as many people as we can, in the hopes that we're reaching some network of people that that hasn't been, you know, tapped by traditional sources of media and communications.
Yes, I mean, something else I wanted to ask on that to both of you. I mean, it looks like from your from what you say, much of the social media campaigning was focused on policy. I mean, this is something that Laura said explicitly. Especially with Warren's campaign, there was a lot of focus on actually facts, data, policies, and so on and so forth, and really showing what the platform ultimately was, right? What were the pledges that were made to the electorate and so on and so forth. But then obviously social media are also very tied to personality and celebrity, right? And we've seen that more and more. I think Instagram really, in a way, made that really apparent, right? When Instagram celebrity culture, and I think some successful social media politicians were really able to tap into that, right? I think also during the primary season was really interesting how Beto O'Rourke and Kamala Harris, though they were unsuccessful ultimately, but how they used Instagram precisely to do that, right? To create a sort of affective bond with the electorate, to show that they were just people in flesh and bones, right? I remember that live stream of Beto O'Rourke at the dentist, which was to me really is an example of how far this sort of public intimacy can go, right? I mean, can think about AOC and when she live streamed her cooking, and she basically was talking politics as she was cooking, right? So yeah, I'm wondering, what's your take on that? I mean, for example, with Joe Biden's campaign, in the sense that perhaps one of the problems with Joe Biden being a long-term career politician was presenting himself as a sort of, was to endear the audience, especially the youth audience, to show, yes, I mean, I've been there, whatever, in power for a long time, or in Congress for a long time, and then in the White House as well. But hey, I'm a person who is actually in touch, right, who has an understanding of the life of ordinary people, of the problems ordinary people face. So I was wondering, what you think about that. I mean, was something done specifically that you witnessed, I mean, by social media accounts connected to the Biden campaign to do that, right, to present whatever Joe, right, as a more accessible figure, and did it work? Or say, perhaps kind of Biden perhaps won regardless of that, but say, I was just wondering whether something happened in that regard. Laura?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, the fact that Joe Biden has been a politician for so long really helped him, I think, in the primaries, because people saw Donald Trump and they're like, this is a man with like no political experience. No, maybe it's time for someone who does have experience. And, the Biden campaign definitely proved, like, Joe Biden, was the vice president for 8 years. Like, he knows how the White House works. And, Joe Biden's undergoing the transition team. So now he appointed Ron Klain, who is a very experienced, like, politician and knows, like, the inner workings of the White House really well. So it shows that he's emphasizing experience, even, post-campaign. So in regards to maybe like accessibility for the younger generations, I think that was definitely a challenge we faced, because it's kind of like, well, what's the difference between these two old white guys, for example? So we partnered with a lot of celebrities, for example. Like, we had a live stream with the Marvel cast, for example, and Kamala Harris was also part of that live stream. And Billie Eilish, helped us with stuff. Taylor Swift, Beyonce posted some, pictures, of Joe Biden. So we definitely had a lot of celebrities that helped us once, Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee. So I guess that was like part of our appeal to Generation Z, and also kind of emphasizing like why it's so important to vote. Like, maybe you don't agree with Joe Biden on every single thing, but he's not Trump, so you want to vote Trump out. So that was also an important part of our campaign, I feel.
Yes, I mean, negative framing and negative campaigning was very important in this case, right? Yeah, perhaps definitely more than positive campaigning. Yeah. Georgia.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think Bernie himself is kind of a not celebrity-like personality anyway. So I think it comes naturally to him to be relatable to people. But we did, one of the ways that we tried to be a little more accessible was through actually opening our direct messages on Twitter and on Facebook, and allowing anybody to message Bernie if they wanted to. So, spoiler alert, it wasn't actually Bernie responding, but we had a team of very well-trained and experienced volunteers who responded to every single DM we got. A lot of it was supportive. I think a very, very small percentage of it was not good, but it was mostly messages of support and questions about policies and questions about events. How do I register? How do I go to this event? Like, well, is there still room? Can I, is it accessible? Things like that. And just making it more of a campaign where you could actually talk to us and find out, what we were up to, what was going to doing. And so that team answered thousands and thousands of messages. I think we got something like 5,000 messages within the first few minutes of us opening it up. So it was a lot of work on their part, and it was really impressive because it was managed by staff but answered by volunteers. And so that was one way I think we tried to be more accessible. Was you can't usually send an email to a random politician or campaign and expect to get a response, but our campaign did make it a priority to do that, and social media let us do that in a way where it wasn't just an email address, although we did have an email address, but it was our Facebook DMs and our Twitter DMs, which I think is a more natural way for people to communicate now on social media. So that was one way that we tried to, be accessible and be, I wouldn't say relatable, but a little more just open to the public and not just like a closed off campaign or closed off politician who you can't read. You can actually hear from us. You can find out what's happening, and we'll get back to you.
Brilliant. Yes, because this is very important. I think it's really something that is in line with the logic of social media, where people expect feedback, right? They expect something, expect the dialogue to be interactive in a way, right? So that's really interesting. We have many more questions to discuss. I mean, unfortunately, it has been confirmed that we will not be able to have Daniel Kreis with us. Again, Microsoft, you're bad. And so we have many more questions to discuss, so we can go on for some more time. I mean, there are questions. This was another interesting question for Laura. You mentioned the idea of simplifying information when creating videos for the public to understand. Do you think there is a danger in oversimplifying information in terms of education, in terms of educating the public on political policies?
There is a danger of oversimplification for sure. I would say that a lot of the videos that we made, the ones that performed well, were ones that are like hyper specific. So we did like a series of like react videos, if you're familiar with those, like on YouTube. So like we had like nurses react to something, teachers react to something, people from Michigan react to something, and people really identify with those. Like, as you said earlier, like social media is a lot about like, personality and like your own sense of identity, and those react videos and like other similar stuff that we did where we targeted like very specific group, they resonated well with audiences. Like people want to see people like themselves represented. So while it's important to like know certain policy positions and that sort of thing, like we directed everyone to the Joe Biden website, where you can read more about his policies. And we also partnered with other like Instagram accounts and like TikTok, people on TikTok and that sort of thing, who would like kind of explain his policy positions. Over this summer, especially like the Black Lives movements became popular. There's a trend of like PowerPoint activism on Instagram, where people were making like carousels that like explain certain stuff, and like people would like share them to their stories. So we made some of those ourselves, and then we also partnered with Instagram accounts that specifically did those, and they explain like certain parts of his policies that are difficult to understand and that sort of thing. So I think we did a good job of being hyper specific, but also like explaining things that like people could understand.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura. Georgia, yeah, we have talked just about, again, the progressive camp, about Democratic candidates, but obviously you also have an understanding of say, the other front of the campaign. I mean, Donald Trump, how effective using social media was Donald Trump campaign this year? Yeah, I mean, what is your sense of the actual effectiveness? Because again, if one looks at the metrics, right, if one looks at the number of likes, and the number of Twitter followers, but also the number of retweets and the actual kind of reach of those tweets by Trump alone, one would say he definitely won the social media battle. So is that just a sort of a skewed impression, a false impression, or is it true? And yeah, and how different was it, you think, from 2016?
Yeah, so I think one of the really important factors to look at with like his success in his ability to reach people on social is that the social media companies, mainly Facebook and YouTube, I think, reward the kind of division, the intensity, the emotional fear that they try to drive in people. Like the algorithm rewards content that's very explosive, very emotional, and that's the kind of stuff that gets a lot of engagement. The kind of messages that Trump and especially Fox News, if you look at Fox News's engagement, it's off the charts. It's absolutely unbelievable. And we knew that we would never come close to what they were getting, but we could try, and we could start building the foundation so that if we were to take on Donald Trump in the general, we would be able to hopefully, if not compete with that, start building a network of progressive pages and leftist and democratic pages on Facebook and across social media that could hopefully compete with that. But one of the really big problems is that that's built into how Facebook and YouTube work, because they reward that kind of engagement that's driven on that's built on misinformation, that's built on fear, that's built on spreading racial resentment towards immigrants, resentment towards Muslims, resentment towards all kinds of marginalized groups. That's the kind of content that thrives on these platforms. So it's very difficult to compete with that when you're trying to spread a message of positivity, of justice, of racial inclusivity, and it's just not really what the platform, I think, rewards. So we were always kind of trying to play a game that wasn't set up for us. And so I think a lot of, when you look at Donald Trump's engagement, that's not going away anytime soon. Even though he lost the election, I'm sure, I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but I'm sure he's getting just massive amounts of engagement on every platform, especially Twitter, especially Facebook. And so that for me is scary, because I want Democrats and left to be able to compete with that. But it's going to take, I think personally, it's going to take breaking up some of these major social media companies like Facebook and like YouTube that reward engagement that's based on misinformation, based on hatred, based on fear, even though that's like technically what what people want to see is stuff that lots of people are engaging with, but there's no real regulation of it. There's no real fact checking happening, although they claim they're trying. I don't really see it happening. I don't see them, taking down stuff that's where Trump is claiming that he won the election, where clearly he didn't. It's not getting removed. It's still there. It's still getting shared, thousands of times. So that, I think, is going to be, I think that was a huge factor in his success, is that they're taking advantage of how these platforms work really, really well. And the right wing has been very successful at that. And I hope that the left finds more success in trying to compete with that. But I think it's going to take changing, tech policy and changing the platforms themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in a way, one could say that social media are biased in favor of the right, because, I mean, we recently doing some research precisely on these, on the correlation, for example, between emotions and engagement and sharing. And we are doing now a paper on right-wing leaders in Europe, and there is a clear sense there is a very strong correlation between negative emotions and the actual amount of sharing activity. So that, which would suggest that people tend to share contents, not people, more specifically, kind of the right electorate or the right social media users tend to share content that spark anger and outrage, right? For example, migration. Look how many migrants are coming to our shores. That's the kind of typical content that gets shared, right? Though then, I mean, one can say that on the left, one sees similar phenomena with, or similar trends with positive content, right? So, and there is actually a huge debate among digital communication scholars about whether the correlation is with the sort of emotional polarity, negative or positive, or with intensity, emotional intensity. So perhaps it's not that negative emotions per se are more conducive to engagement and sharing, but is high intensity emotions that can also be positive are correlated with a more stronger engagement by users. So perhaps we can have the last round of questions. And one question for Laura. I mean, I think one interesting question there was about data analytics. I mean, you're not a data analytics expert, obviously, but it's, I mean, perhaps you have something to say on that, and specifically regarding your creative work. I mean, when you are creating motion designs, I mean, do you also use data analytics about social media engagement or social media users that are connected to those platforms, or this doesn't really matter for your creative process?
Yeah, so I mean, as a motion designer, I wasn't super involved with like the data analytics, but we had a few people on the digital team specifically who told us like data analytics like every day for our morning meetings, and they would tell us like certain topics that are trending that might be good to make a video about, like certain like Google keywords or like suddenly being trending for some reason. Maybe we should make videos off of that. I mean, what was being said earlier about maybe like positive and like negative emotions when making videos. A lot of our most like popular videos, the ones with the most views, were very negative, like anti-Trump. Like I made this like a video where it was right after Trump got coronavirus and he came back to the White House and he's seen taking off the mask. So I made this video where it shows Joe Biden's putting on the mask and then Donald Trump taking off the mask, and it went viral. Like it got 10 million views within like 24 hours. So, and that was like one of our like best performing like videos that we made, and it was just like a stupid video that I made. But that sort of like negative thing can also like backfire, because the Trump campaign was running a lot of like negative ads against Joe Biden, and it was like showing like footage of like war-torn streets, and they're like, this is Joe Biden's America, like there's something like protests, like things lit on fire, like Joe Biden's a socialist, like that sort of thing. But it's like, if you know anything at all about like Joe Biden or like American politics, like he's not a socialist, like he's considered very moderate. So that backfired on them because they didn't have like a cohesive theme in attacking Joe Biden. Like, there's disinformation, but then there's also like anyone who knows Joe Biden like knows it's not true. So it didn't work out in their favor.
It is interesting also because sometimes it looks as if the progressives, say the center left, is more afraid than the right going negative, right? Because it assumes that going negative is whatever, either vulgar or demeaning or right against basic kind of human feelings of solidarity. But indeed, as it has been seen in recent years, say in the 2010s, which now we can look at as a past decade, often is really, really effective in focusing public attention and in creating identity on your side, right? By saying these are our enemies. And I think Trump's success is very much related to that, right? Because he picked very clearly who his enemies were, right? And he constantly attacked them on Twitter, on social media, and on TV. So that is quite interesting as a more general thing. So the last question for Georgia. I mean, there was a question here on how important you think were contents produced by ordinary people, say by voters who posted their content on social media. And connected to that, so perhaps also is a kind of a real wrap-up question is how, I mean, the way, given that Biden had less visibility on social media, less followers and likes on social media compared to Trump, did he make up for that through these endorsements, right, that Laura was mentioning before, and through by means of support by other leaders such as Kamala Harris, then obviously became vice president and a vice presidential nominee, and Bernie Sanders, who I think add more at least, definitely Sanders, more social media following, right? So how important was this contribution by former primary challengers and now allies?
Yeah, so I think for the question of Biden compared to Trump in terms of following and engagement, I think one thing that I think Trump does have a roof of support. Unfortunately, it's a pretty high roof, but I do think that there is eventually they will max out on how many people they can turn out. And so there's even though they have a massive amount of social media, they have a massive following, massive engagement, I think at some point, they're not turning swing voters, they're not turning Democrats, they're really just playing to their base. And I think that's what they did very successfully, obviously, and got but they are at the end of the day still just firing up their base on social media. And so I think there is a limit to what you can do, and our strategy was always to expand the electorate and expand not just who our base was, but who the entire Democratic primary electorate was in general, and bring in people who hadn't voted before. To varying degrees of success depending on the state and the demographic, but I think I think there's so many factors as to why Biden won, but I think there is a limit to Trump's influence, which is good news for the left. I think we saw how little I think I think Trump's 2020 campaign was how little of it was focused on policy compared to 2016, where he was talking about building the wall and and trade and things like that. This time it was much more, I think, inflammatory and much less policy focused. And so when we saw the consequences of that, and that he lost and Biden won. And I think I think the fact that Biden did develop like a robust digital operation in the general, and have the types of great videos that Laura was making and others, and still reaching as many people as possible, even if it wasn't as many as Trump. I think as long as if you're reaching your base, if you're reaching as many people as you possibly can, there's going to be a limit to what the opposition can do. And I think that's what ended up happening with Trump, is that they weren't expanding who they were reaching, or who they were motivating. More like, I think even though I'm the last person to be a Trump follower, I still see his content because it gets shared on Twitter and it gets shared everywhere. So it might reach lots of people, but that doesn't mean you're convincing them, or that doesn't mean that you're changing anyone's mind or impression. So I think and the Biden campaign obviously was focused a lot on turning out swing voters, turning out moderates, turning out people who might actually be influenced by stuff that they see on social. Whereas I think Trump's reputation was, and his policies are very well known after 4 years of this, and so I think Biden could definitely benefit from that and have a more positive message and have it actually resonate.
Brilliant. Yeah, it looked almost as if Trump was not the incumbent president, right? But he was the challenger in certain ways. He was not defending even his policies that much. So it was, again, a very surreal campaign. And we are very glad that you were here with us today to look at this campaign and the influence of social media. Again, we're very sorry we couldn't also have Daniel with us. It will be for the next time. So I'd like to thank very much Laura and Georgia for the time and energy you gave us and all your experience on digital campaigning. And I also would like to thank the attendees for their attention, their contribution with questions and comments. I hope you all enjoyed it. And I wish you a pleasant Friday night, perhaps spent at home, and a nice weekend. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.